Hello and welcome to another episode of Swedenborg Room. I'm the Reverend Thom Muller here with my buddy Rudy Caseres. And today we will be continuing our conversation on Swedenborg and particularly on his writings. I'll give it to Rudy for some more words on his end.
Hey, everyone out there in the world. I am Rudy Caseres. As you can see, I am the digital communications manager for the Swedenborgian Church of North America, but I'm here as myself to sit under the learning tree of the good Reverend. So I'm excited about this. This is episode 2, and we're going to dive deeper into some of the famous works by Emmanuel Swedenborg, and I get to learn a lot. And I'm going to give it back to the expert in this subject, Reverend Thom Muller.
Sweet. Yeah, Rudy and I figured we'll just kind of have a casual discussion, kind of have a broad overview of some of the more well-known or important works that Swedenborg wrote. We talked in the past about some of his life and some of his basic ideas. And of course, a question comes up. If I am into this, if I'm resonating with this, if this interests me, what are some good things to read? And we'll be focusing on primary sources, which is Swedenborg's published theological writings. So there's plenty that he wrote. He has an inexhaustible amount of writings, and that includes his scientific works, his unpublished works, the works he wrote in his mystical period, such as his dream journal, and it includes his published theological writings. So the ones that I'll be discussing today are 4 of sort of perhaps the most important, if I could use that term, ones of Swedenborg's works, just to give us a kind of brief idea of what we're talking about. There's a couple that I won't be getting into of his published theological writings. Secrets of Heaven is sort of his magnum opus in some ways, but it's kind of long and confusing and often not a good starter. It really focuses on symbology and gives sort of an intro on his own process there. Other ones that I will not be discussing today that we will be discussing in the future are some of his other theological works, such as the New Jerusalem, which is a pretty decent overview of his theology, Other Planets, Conjugal Love, Apocalypse Revealed, White Horse. But today, I figured we would leave those kind of on the periphery and focus on what are perhaps his most popular and perhaps most useful works. So the number one that people read, and it's by far his bestseller, would be this guy, Heaven and Hell. And Rudy, I don't know how familiar you are with that particular work, but I don't know if you have thoughts about that particular one. I know you're somewhat familiar with it. Heaven and Hell is his bestseller not only because it has an exciting topic with which he is often associated, which is his experience of the afterlife, but it also, in some ways, is a nice little is not the right word, but compared to Secrets of Heaven, it's a smaller attempt of him to kind of condense some of his ideas.
So I'm going to give you what my understanding of it is, and I could be completely wrong. But
Okay.
this is what the podcast is about. It's based
Love
on
it.
my very limited knowledge compared to you. So heaven is where instead of like going to this place in the clouds and stereotypical, you got the sky god, and it's more of, if you're not matter of whether you're a good person or if you're a bad person, you go to hell. It's what you choose to how to live your life, and then that's how it's reflected in the afterlife. So if I'm just generally just selfish and uncaring and just violent or what have you, I would go to a place that reflects that self. Some might interpret that as hell or the bad place. Whereas if you're someone who is righteous and considerate and loving of your neighbor and giving and wanting to do podcasts with little old me, then you would go to what people would normally consider heaven, but that's up for interpretation, and that there is. Correct me. This is the part that I get tripped off on. That there's different levels, not necessarily like kings and queens, but more as like levels of angels. So you can reach that point of angels, and we can talk on and on and on about what an angel is. But and then when you get there, you can actually you can still get married or find love in heaven. So you're just because you didn't find your true love in our current realm, that doesn't mean that you can't find it in the other realm, or you could just be in heaven with your true love that you had in person and your kids too, but maybe not your dogs. And so
only if he was a good boy.
Okay. So to be clear, is your dog coming with you to heaven?
You'll have to ask my dog.
Okay, so how did that sound?
That actually sounded pretty good. That sounded really awesome. Actually, I really like that perspective, and I think you really hit. You touched on some really important things to bear in mind, even with the terminology heaven and hell. Right? Swedenborg did not believe in a heaven and a hell as places of punishment or of reward that people go to because they believe or don't believe certain things. To Swedenborg, heaven and hell are primarily states, right? So it's tempting for us to kind of look at heaven and hell as something we would get to. What Swedenborg says is that, sure, when our physical body dies, our spiritual self continues to dwell in realms that we feel comfortable in and that we have an affinity for. But what's really central to Swedenborg is that heaven and hell as spiritual states are states that we are constantly engaging in right now and right here. So we are, in a very sense, right now in heaven or in hell. And that all depends on the spiritual state that we place ourselves in. And of course, you would have to kind of qualify a little bit. What does a heavenly state mean? What does a hellish state mean? To Swedenborg, in many ways, it really boils down to basic ethics in some sense. So a heavenly state would be a state that is characterized by love for others, compassion for others, and a sense of truthfulness and truth-seeking. A quote-unquote hellish state would simply be the reverse. So a hellish state would be a state in which we embrace actions and ways of beings that are centered around controlling other people, using other people, doing harm to other people, taking credit for other people's work, et cetera, et cetera. And again, these are not states necessarily even of suffering. These are states of self-realization. So Swedenborg did believe that we inhabit these states, hellish, heavenly, in this lifetime, and yeah, we can travel there in the afterlife if that's something you believe in. Something really interesting, a little anecdote about heaven and hell that Swedenborg makes is he has this vision of folks who are living in a quote unquote hellish state, meaning a state in which they're really enjoying being selfish or controlling, and they get to do that. And that they are invited at any time to come hang out in heaven. But as soon as they get there, they just don't resonate with it. They don't like it. So one man or woman's heaven is the other's hell, and vice versa. It's something really important to believe. And again, that this is not a matter of punishment that is imposed on people, but something we freely choose based on our affinities. Yeah.
So to be clear, so you said that you can be in heaven or hell and right now. So what's the difference for when you die? I know Swedenborg has a different view of death, but why even die if it's just going to be the same heaven or hell anyway? What's the heaven and hell in the afterlife, and how does that differ from what we have right now, according to Heaven and Hell, the book?
Yeah, that's actually a really great, important question. I think one term that stands out for me when I think about this is self-realization. So we all live our lives under varieties of circumstances and varieties of opportunities to really realize our true will, what we really want to be like, what we live like because of circumstantial stuff. I mean, that's obviously our journey in life, right? So the notion is that, again, when our physical body dies and the sort of constraints of that or of that primarily physical experience falls off, we then have the opportunity to pursue our true loves, our true self, our true will more freely. Because in the spiritual world, things like distance, things like time and space are matters of states, and they are not constrained by these externalities. So we truly get to be who we want to be, which is something that we obviously don't have that full ability during our journey here. So it's this really, I think, beautiful concept that one of my minister colleagues tends to say that the basis of Swedenborg's afterlife idea is basically everybody gets exactly what they want, in the sense that we truly get to self-realize in a way to where our quote-unquote external environment mirrors our inner affections and affinities and desires.
So my question is, why even bother with this world that we have right now? Why can't we just skip to that part and then we figure it out? Why this part where there's suffering and all these other bad things? Like, why do we have to work our way to that place and die in the process? Sometimes very, very horrible deaths that are completely meaningless. What does
Yep.
Swedenborg say about that?
Yeah. Those are some of those huge, big questions. And of course, we could have many, many, many podcasts about this. Um, One way of approaching it, and of course, this ties into all of these questions of why does God allow suffering? What is the purpose of life, et cetera, et cetera. One way of thinking about this particular question is the notion that if we, how do I put this in a way that doesn't sound too strange? To Swedenborg, the purpose of life, and he says this very clearly in Divine Love and Wisdom 170, is a reunion with the created universe with the creator, right? So that's what heaven would be. Heaven would be returning to a state of harmony with the divine, right? Now, Swedenborg believed that there is no such thing as compulsory union or compulsory devotion or even compulsory love. So that then again brings us back to the question of free will, et cetera, et cetera. And I personally don't find that the free will answer usually suffices. It can be kind of a cop out. But one way of imagining it is one idea that exists in theology and philosophy is the idea of universal salvation. And Swedenborg, by some, is called someone who believes in universal salvation based on the notion that Swedenborg believed that everyone can, quote unquote, be saved. You don't have to be of any particular religion, et cetera, et cetera. You have to live an ethical life, care about others, et cetera, et cetera. What's important, though, is that when we use the term universal salvation, some people have this concept of a superimposed heavenly perfection where everyone just is 100% perfect 100% of the time, has wonderful, that kind of heaven that some of our popular culture might portray. To Swedenborg, that cannot exist, because for there to be things such as true mutual affection, true care for others, there needs to be the opportunity to freely choose to do that. So that's one of the answers in terms of why this complicated stuff. Why are we not simply born perfect with, as little automatons that say I love God and I love my neighbor? If there is no choice, we cannot possibly do that, says Swedenborg.
But say I was raised in a completely different tradition, and when I die, I go on to Swedenborg's vision of heaven or hell. Wouldn't I be really disappointed that it's nothing like how I imagine it?
I mean, I can't speak for you, but probably not, because it might be exactly how you imagine it, right? Because if you have set your particular affections and affinities towards certain ideas, those ideas may very well be reflected in your afterlife. The point, again, is not that you are somehow in a superimposed state of heavenliness, but that you literally just realize or have an opportunity to more deeply connect with that which in many cases you already believe. And there's this one of the funny, well, not really funny, one of the interesting things that Swedenborg describes is a place called the world of spirits, which is not the same thing as the spiritual world. The world of spirits is sort of an intermediary stage. A lot of people talk about actually in NDEs, where we get an opportunity to kind of reflect on certain things, to learn certain things that allows us to truly self-realize. So that would kind of go into the question of, well, what if I lived my entire life believing in the flying spaghetti monster? That would be fine. If you live an ethical life, you may be in a state afterwards in which you then realize, oh, maybe the whole spaghetti monster thing wasn't all that useful. So it's much less of sort of a one size fits all, but there really, in some sense, are as many heavens as there are human beings.
So real quick, acronym alert, NDE. Obviously, I know because I'm smart. Duh. Near-death experiences, and that probably warrants its own episode as well. But I've heard from quite a few Swedenborgians in these near-death experiences. They were able to witness the Swedenborgian view of the afterlife. Or is afterlife, even going on tangent, is afterlife the correct word? How would you describe this, what I like to call other realm? And then go into near-death experiences.
There's a saying among Swedenborgians, or a phrase when someone has died, is oftentimes Swedenborgians will say X, Y, and Z has entered into the fullness of the spiritual world. And I think that's actually quite fitting, right? This notion that this isn't simply this other place that you now get to. It means that you are now more fully in touch with the spiritual reality that has already underlied your quote unquote earthly experience, if that makes any sense.
Right. And so it's just, I'm trying to get to like the bottom of it. I'd like to at every episode be able to tell you this is what I learned, and here's where I want to take with that knowledge. Maybe not today. So what do you hope to in the afterlife? What do you hope to get out of that? I would assume that how you live your life might be different from other Swedenborgians. You might both be righteous, moral people, but for you, Reverend Thom Muller, how do you see this going down?
Well, that's a good question. I guess it really boils down to the you get what you want thing. Is we do all have different desires, and we do all have different outlooks and goals. To me, I find it really important to focus, including with the engagement of heaven and hell, on the here and now. So I'm personally, that there are a lot of, since you're asking me sort of personally as an individual dude, there's a lot of Swedenborgians who are drawn into Swedenborg because of these afterlife metaphysics. And that's really awesome. And you mentioned the NDE, near-death experience connection. That's a big draw for a lot of people. I personally am most interested in heaven and hell as a deeper insight into our own present psyche. And this opens a whole nother can of worms that I'll just very briefly touch on, which is that there are many levels of reading Swedenborg. Swedenborg believed that, yes, when he's visiting heaven and hell, he is actually seeing sort of universal realities about the afterlife. much more importantly, he believed that he is seeing spatio-temporal images that represent spiritual realities that are occurring right now. So you could read Heaven and Hell with absolutely no attachment to the afterlife, and it would still be an incredibly valuable work. Because once again, Swedenborg believed that the inner always trumps the outer. And that is not only true with, say, scripture, where you have these kind of mythological narratives that are mirrors of inner reality. The same is true for his own experiences. There's a universality to it that is not simply about afterlife metaphysics, but about sort of the nature of reality, which is much more broad. In some way, you could ask, well, which part of myself is asking questions such as, where will I be? What will I feel? What will it look like, right? Is that our angelic self that's asking those questions, or is that our egoic self? Which matters more, right? And that actually ties us very beautifully into another work that I'd really like to discuss.
Sure.
Which is my personal favorite. And that would be A Divine Love and Wisdom. That's another one of the sort of common, if you go to a Swedenborgian center, you likely have these 4 books available on a book table. Divine Love and Wisdom is a work that I believe really, really cuts to the very center of Swedenborgian theology, which is the belief that the nature of God is love and truth, and that the means for us to reunite with God, to regenerate, is by us embracing those qualities of love and truth. It is also a very philosophical work, so it's kind of hard to read for some people if they don't have that inclination. But if you're someone who really cares about sort of these deep, deep philosophical questions around meaning, the nature of reality, the nature of God, the role of our human journey, Divine Love and Wisdom is kind of where I would point you.
Okay, so I want to break these 3 words down: divine love and wisdom. How would you interpret, or Emmanuel Swedenborg, or how you differ from Emmanuel Swedenborg,
Sure.
love, wisdom, and what makes them divine?
Yeah, that's some very good questions. So if you look at Swedenborgian theology, or Swedenborg's idea of what or who or where God is, Swedenborg would say that the 2 concepts or qualities that we can imagine, that we can conceive, that come closest to what God is, what the reality of and the nature of God is, are love and truth. And that means that Swedenborg believed that love and truth are at the center not only of creation, but at the center of everything that exists. He writes in Divine Love and Wisdom that, and I mentioned this before, the purpose of creation is to be reunited to divine love and wisdom by means of divine love and wisdom. So what love is, in a practical sense, I think especially when we look at our own life and how he would understand living in a life that is God-centered, meaning love and truth-centered. Love he defines as, in one instance, feeling another's joy as one's own. Love to Swedenborg is all about caring about others, being quote-unquote selfless, not in an unhealthy, self-deprecating way, but in prioritizing and truly caring about other human beings and about the divine over selfish motivations or self-interest. Truth or wisdom to Swedenborg is simply reality as it is. And truthful living would be living our life in a way that is honest, that is truthful, both with others and with ourselves. So Swedenborg really did believe that, quote unquote, the equation for what some would call salvation or enlightenment or union with God is extremely simple. All we have to do is, to our best ability, live loving and truthful lives. and we're good. And if we do that, we are right now in heaven. And then, there's this plethora of ways that we can engage in rituals and ideas and concepts. But that's really it. It's very simple. One instance he writes, it is not as difficult as people believe to live a heavenly life, because it really just boils down to those two things.
Well, let me ask you, are you right now living a heavenly life?
I think right now, in this particular moment, I'm inclined to, because I feel like we are in a state of love and of truth seeking. That's all I can say. We all vary. None of us are perfect. And of course, a response that folks sometimes get when they propose this is, well, but people have so many varying ideas of what truth is and varying ideas of what love is. So we all might do whatever we want and still call it love or wisdom. And that's a very good point. But my response to that is, imagine a world in which, before doing or saying something, every single person took a moment and honestly asked themselves, is this really the most loving thing I can do? And is this really the most truthful thing I can do or say? Imagine if we actually did that. There would still be ignorance, misunderstanding, conflict, but things would be radically different, I would argue. And then Swedenborg would argue that once we pass on from the constraints of this world, it'll be even more easy to be in that kind of harmonious coexistence with each other.
So if you're the kind of person who's like, oh man, I love stealing, I love doing all the bad things in the world, how is that different from, say, you who loves sharing and caring and all that stuff? What is the key difference between how that person feels joy and how you feel joy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, of course, we'll have to try to see what the difference is. But, one of the things that turns some people that come from a more traditional backgrounds off about Swedenborg is the notion that people in hell may very well be enjoying themselves. But there's a very big difference between joy and pleasure. And there's a very big difference between gratifying quote unquote loves or desires and engaging in a truly creative, unitive form of love. So Swedenborg would say that in the afterlife, if hurting or if controlling other people's, being in states of meanness, if that is truly what we want to do, we absolutely get to do it. And we are missing out, because ultimately heaven is reality, hell is falsity. Heaven is reunion with the ultimate. Hell is distance from the ultimate. So a major difference is, well, if you live a heavenly life, you are much closer to ultimate reality, to that which actually is. If you are living a life of being a jerk to others, you're missing out. But you do have that freedom, and the freedom to do that continues, because to Swedenborg, that notion of agency is so incredibly central. He says there cannot be anything spiritual happening in our lives if it doesn't come, again, from truth or an understanding and love, meaning a desire to do something positive.
Do you feel like that's one of your goals as a Swedenborgian pastor, to instill these teachings?
Yeah, I would say so. Swedenborgians are kind of famous for not being proselytizers or evangelizers. And that partly boils back to that concept that, and Swedenborg is very clear about, that people of all faiths, all religions, can lead a heavenly life and be in that heavenly state, provided that they live loving, kind lives. And so if you consider that sort of the core of your religious outlook, then sure, I would love to see a world in which people are more loving and wise, That doesn't mean that people have to be Swedenborgian or anything in particular. But I do believe that Swedenborg is one of the people who points this out to us in a very beautiful way.
So let's go back to Divine Love and Wisdom, the book. What are some deep cuts within there that you feel like get glossed over? Obviously, it's pretty thick tome, so there's got to be stuff that is, as you have someone who has read it and studied it, what are some things that don't get talked about enough?
In Divine Love and Wisdom, I don't know if I have a good answer to that, because Swedenborg does go quite in depth. And honestly, Divine Love and Wisdom is a book that a lot of people find challenging. So my answer would be he doesn't really leave anything out. He really does cut through the chase. It really is a work that, you know, that's part of why I personally would call it my favorite, because it really does cut to those very essentials. The things that are quote unquote left out in Divine Love and Wisdom, such as this broad explanation of afterlife metaphysics, or scriptural exegesis, scriptural interpretation, X, Y, and Z, Christology. You don't find a lot of those in there because, again, these are sort of the very central teachings. But there we have all the other good ones, right? We have heaven and hell, if you're really into the afterlife metaphysics. You have life on other planets, if that's something you're really into.
Let's go.
We have apocalypse
Now,
revealed, if you're really into the symbology of end times themes, which of course Swedenborg believed had a symbolic meaning. He's certainly not a doomsday sort of dude, but there's it's one of the beautiful things about there being so many works of Swedenborg. But I would say that a great compendium or overview would be Heaven and Hell, and something that really gets at the core of things would be Divine Love and Wisdom. Now, you mentioned, actually, it's interesting that a lot of our conversation today kind of organically merged into the question of the purpose of life. And there's a term that's used in theology and in philosophy called theodicy. And that is basically the discussion around that major question that humanity's always been asking is, why does God allow suffering, right?
Right.
Swedenborg wrote a book that addresses some of that. And that would be the next one I'm going to recommend.
Here we go.
Divine Providence. And Divine Providence is a book that's great for folks who are asking exactly those questions. And it really focuses on, how does divine reality manifest in our lives? How does, quote unquote, God care for us? How does God express its love to us, et cetera, et cetera? So Divine Providence really cuts into that thing. And it also really tends to attract folks that are interested in such things as synchronicity, unexplained phenomena in our life, notions of, well, are we predestined? Is there such a thing as fate? Swedenborg would say no to both of those. But, you know, a lot of those kind of existential questions that kind of cut to sort of those big challenges of the human experience. Swedenborg was not a classical theist. He did not believe that God magically intervenes in our life, say through, I pray for X, Y, and Z, and then God magically makes it happen. He did believe that on a more subtle level, God is constantly with us and is in fact leading our lives in a way that benefits us, and sort of reconciling that idea with the idea of agency and the idea of a non-intervening God is a really fascinating topic to discuss. And again, cuts to very, very deep questions that you mentioned, such as the theodicy idea.
Okay, break it down. Define providence, and while we're at it, define synchronicity. Go ahead.
Oh, damn. Okay. That's a challenge. Providence.
It's what we're here
Swedenborg, for. Right. Absolutely. Providence, of course, if we trace it back to the Latin, would simply be, well, providence or provision. God, the notion that God provides, the notion that God has an idea of where our life is moving towards. That's how people generally, I think, would use providence. To Swedenborg, divine providence is the way in which the divine moves in our life and moves within us to benefit us, to help us on that journey of self-realization. And so there's this dynamic that's constantly there in Swedenborg of us being vessels of the divine and being blessed in different ways that we can receive and distribute, so to speak. So the notion of divine providence, again, is the idea of ultimately there's a purpose to this life, and ultimately that purpose is benevolent.
So, do you have any personal experiences, any anecdotes with providence or even synchronicity? Some spooky stuff, maybe?
Oh, yeah, synchronicity, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that I'm the best person to define synchronicity. I probably should have prepared for that if I wanted to do that. But, we all have those experiences, right, of things that happen in our life where, for example, we feel connected to other people in ways that seem profound or beyond what we may reasonably imagine. We all, many of us at least, have had experiences where we were exposed to something, an idea, a place that seemed like it was a message of some sort. We all have had experiences where coincidences just don't seem to really be coincidences, right? Those are, I think, experiences that many of us have. And Swedenborg believed that he had some insight into what's going on there. And it really all boils down to that core belief that we are all connected spiritually with each other and with the divine, and that there's this whole underlying reality that we're living in, of which sort of our egoic mind-body experience is only a tiny fraction. And so engaging that realm, again, with the perspective of, is there a divine benevolent source that desires our well-being and our happiness? His answer is yes, and he would elaborate on how he came to that conclusion.
Yeah, you got to be ready for the occasional curveball question from me. So, how did Swedenborg, how did he was able to access or discover this information within divine providence? How did he get to where we are now reading it hundreds of years later?
Yeah, that is a big question. What was Swedenborg's process? And Swedenborg's process took on many different forms. We mentioned a little bit in our episode where we talked about Swedenborg, the man, about some of his initial awakenings and so forth. So we have to remember that Swedenborg is already a major intellectual. He is a polymath. He's what one would call a Renaissance man. Of course, he didn't live in the Renaissance, but you're familiar with the term. He was a genius dude, right, who really knew how to write, or at least he knew how to write a lot. There's, from a literary perspective, there's some questions about how beautifully put his scientific Neo-Latin really is, right? But Swedenborg was someone who was extremely intelligent, extremely knowledgeable, and really an extremely critically thinking kind of person. We see him writing, obviously, lots of stuff in his scientific period, including philosophical stuff. What happens after his mystical awakening in the 1740s is that he kind of, as he claims himself, breaks that boundary between what one might call philosophy or theology to revelation. So what we now call the published theological works of Swedenborg do hold a kind of special place for him, because he did believe that they were the result of a deep, direct connection with the divine. in terms of where he got that and where his visions came from, his dream journal, as well as his spiritual diary, offer us some really great insight into his process. And there's different theories about how his process happened. We know that he practiced what's called hypnagogic breathing. So he would put himself into these kind of ecstatic out of body states in which he witnessed a lot of the things that he saw. And of course, he spent a lot of time in his writing processing those things that he saw, as someone would do with a high intellect.
Have you tried to do those breathing exercises yourself?
Yeah, I mean, there's people who have really looked into this in terms of similarities to, say, pranayama, meditation, and many other forms. And people have compared some of his process and what's happening to the brain to things like DMT. People have looked at psychedelic experiences and other forms of mystical experiences and how they relate. And that's actually quite interesting, because we're finding out more and more things about that as culture seems to kind of have a revival of an interest in altered states. So the truth is, the jury's still out. I mean, I recently was reading about a person who, it's actually a fairly prominent Swedenborg biographer, who believed that the cause for Swedenborg's mystical experiences was that he contracted syphilis from a sex worker, and the syphilis caused him to have hallucination. I don't think there's a whole lot of evidence to support that particular theory, but it gives you some insight into how much people are still mystified with how did he produce this stuff. And again, the unpublished dream journal and spiritual diary, unpublished meaning posthumously published, really gained some insight into that, because it seems pretty clear that he didn't just sit down and make this up. He really had some profound experiences, which he privately recorded, that give us some insight into this. But once again, what's important to remember is that while Swedenborg himself had these extremely, so quite literally outlandish experiences, he believed that the process of going within, reconnecting with the spiritual world and with the divine, were something that we're all entitled to. It may not manifest in those kind of flamboyant ways that he experienced, but the ultimate journey of reconnecting with the spiritual reality is something he claims all of us can do.
Right, but if it was just about, say, doing some spiritual breathing exercises, or keeping a dream journal, or doing psychedelics, you'd think there would be like 1,000 more Swedenborgs in the world. What happened there?
Exactly. So that's a very good point. One of the frustrating things, one might say, that some people find frustrating about Swedenborg is he does not give you specific practices or exercises or rituals that are sort of keys to unlocking that higher spiritual self. To Swedenborg, it all boils down, once again, to love and wisdom. If practicing hypnagogic breathing and talking to spirits and angels makes you a more loving, kind, truthful person, those are the things that you need in your spiritual development. If doing pranayama yoga is something that helps you be a kind, truthful person, then that's your spiritual practice. If reading Swedenborg makes you a more kind, truthful person, that's awesome. If it doesn't, it's spiritually worthless. So that's where kind of that tension, but also that beauty comes in, where Swedenborg believed that, well, yeah, people have all kinds of religious beliefs and traditions and images of God. Those are all means towards an end. But essentially, again, it all boils down to states. And the states of truthfulness, compassion, kindness are states which he argued all world religions can embed in us, and many different practices and philosophical approaches. So there really isn't a one size fits all. And you find that Swedenborgians land all the way in terms of all across the spectrum in terms of spiritual practices. You have Swedenborgians who practice Zen Buddhist meditation. There are Swedenborgians who don't really have that much of a ritualized life. There are Swedenborgians who have a fairly traditional way of you study the Bible, etc. So it's really a concept of what's important is your spiritual progress, and your spiritual progress depends on nothing in particular except whatever helps you to be kind and loving.
Well, for me, that's my dog. So maybe one day
Yeah.
I can ascend through that.
Absolutely. I mean,
We'll see.
absolutely. And it's very, again, cutting back to the meat of it. Swedenborg would say that act or that state of you loving your dog, that is God. That is literally God. It's not a way to connect to God. It is God. When you love another human being, that is God. Literally, love is God. God is love. When you embrace something that is true, or you realize something that is true, that is literally God, right? So in that sense, sure, if spending time with animals is what brings you into a state of truthfulness, of lovingness, then yeah, that's a absolutely beautifully valid spiritual practice.
All right. Have anything else to say about divine providence?
No. Honestly, I fear it's probably good to move on to the last of the books that
What
I
do you got?
recommend by Swedenborg. And this is something that may appeal to some people, it may not appeal to other people. Something you can probably imagine is Swedenborg wrote this stuff in the 1700s. The world was a very different place. Of course, he was originally from Sweden, which technically never had a state church, but had a de facto state church, the Church of Sweden, which had a Lutheran orthodoxy to it, very stringent. Something that happened pretty immediately as Swedenborg, who of course came from the background of a secular scientist, started writing about such things as the afterlife, the nature of the Bible, the role of Jesus, and so forth. He was, for the most part, not well received by the established Western Christian world that he lived in, which is one of the reasons why he ended up having to publish in places like London, the Netherlands. So something that many people, of course, in the Western context would be interested in is how does Swedenborg's view of some of these core concepts, such as the nature of the Bible, such as the role of Jesus Christ, the nature of Jesus Christ, quote unquote, the idea of salvation, the Trinity, all of those things that would come up for you if you had a traditional Christian background. And what happened with Swedenborg is in the later part of his publishing career, he was getting a lot of criticism and accusations of heresy, which at that time had a very real impact beyond just philosophical, theological debates, right? So the accusation of heresy was still something that was quite serious back then. So what Swedenborg decided to do is he wrote this, what is now a 2-volume work, True Christianity, which honestly, it's kind of a cynical title if you think about it, True Christianity, because it is basically his response to those accusations of heresy. So he goes through a lot of sort of fundamental ideas that were particularly prevalent in 18th century Lutheranism, which was his sort of immediate field, but go into these very broad questions that are very essential to really all of institutionalized Christianity. And he goes into basically defending his stances, but also critiquing things that he sees that are wrong with the Christian world. He very strongly condemns basically all of the foundational concepts in traditional Christianity. Has a very very different view, for example, on the role and life of Jesus. And I don't know if there might be any questions that come up for you as I'm rambling about this.
So where does how does that all sync up together? Whereas Swedenborg was so critical of the Christianity at the time, so how do we circle back to being where we, the Swedenborgians, today are considered a Christian denomination that still views the Old and New Testament as holy works? Many see it more so as true revelation than Swedenborg's own books. What say you to that?
So the question of why Swedenborg would bother with the theme, I think it's very important to acknowledge that while Swedenborg's theology is very universal, he was very much a Christian. And we will have to, I guess there are many, many different ideas of what does that mean? What is a Christian? What is Christ? Swedenborg is someone who is sometimes put into the restorationalist camp of Christianity, which is controversial on whether or not that is an accurate description, although it probably fits some of his followers. Basically, Swedenborg falls into the camp who believed that the original message of Jesus Christ was pure and awesome, that Jesus Christ literally was, in fact, that human manifestation of the divine. And that, perhaps most importantly, the narrative of Jesus is a direct correspondence of our own spiritual growth. So you would say that every single stage that we read about in the life of Jesus is a stage in our own inner progress, our own spiritual progress. And going back to this whole true Christianity question, there are certain things that Swedenborg believed that Christ is not, and that Christianity is not. To Swedenborg, as to many other Christian mystics, Christ, Jesus, the Lord, as he puts it, is something that is directly related to our life right now and serves as an image and an incarnation of that potential of God realization. So whereas much of Christianity, or certainly within the Western Christian world, a predominant number of Christians have in their theology, whether it's conscious or more unconscious, a notion of sacrifice and of atonement, right? The idea that Jesus Christ came and was sacrificed as an atonement for sin, and that belief in Jesus Christ or adherence to particular sacraments is the way that we make use of that atoning sacrifice. Swedenborg completely rejects that idea. So he completely rejects an idea that is very much central to a very large portion of Christianity. So that is perhaps the most important difference, because he really stands out in that. He also did not believe that there was a continuous preservation of what one might call true Christianity. So Swedenborg is very critical of Christianity as an institution from the very early days on. He's extremely critical of Paul. Of course, the majority of the books of the New Testament are books that Swedenborg does not acknowledge as being part of the Word. He rejects the Nicene Creed, a lot of the early things that established Christianity as a institution. So the in some ways, Swedenborgian Christianity is quite radically different, because the idea of what Jesus is and is not is somewhat radically different from other folks who would consider themselves to be in the Christian tradition. Another thing that's very unique, or somewhat unique, is that one of the core, in this case, Protestant beliefs that he very strongly rejects is the belief in faith alone. So to Swedenborg, being a Christian does not mean proclaiming a belief in the historical Jesus or his resurrection or participating in particular sacraments, but it is the embodied living of the qualities that define the divine human. So someone could be a Christian, technically, in that sense, without having anything to do with quote unquote Christianity. And I feel like that's kind of something that resonates more and more with people in modern days, where they kind of look at the Jesus of the Gospels in this case and go, well, this is a pretty awesome dude. And then you look at Christianity as an institution, as a movement, a lot of things that are beautiful about it, but a lot of things that have clearly diverted a lot from that original message. So Swedenborg has an interesting perspective on that I think a lot of modern folks would find refreshing.
So if Swedenborg is going to differ so much from traditional Christianity and Bibles, even whole books, why didn't he just start his own denomination? It just makes it, for me, that's just easier since it's going to be so different from other denominations. And there's people who wanted to follow his teachings, and many eventually did as a denomination. So what was his I guess, hesitancy or unwillingness to create his own denomination?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I could respond. One way to respond to that is it seems that what Swedenborg himself believed, or predicted might not be the right word because it didn't happen, but what Swedenborg assumed would happen, perhaps a little bit narcissistically so, is Swedenborg believed that the intelligentsia of Europe, academia, the great theological institutions, would basically just suck it all up and just love his stuff. And that this new age of enlightenment that he, of course, is a kind of a prime example of, would lead to a stage where we would almost intuitively realize these things and would almost intuitively, quote unquote, progress to something higher. This, of course, did not happen, right? Swedenborg never had a particularly enthusiastic reception among, say, institutionalized Christianity, et cetera, et cetera. So naturally, what ended up happening is Swedenborgian book groups ended up turning into their own societies and then churches, because that's how things work. But it's really important to remember that Swedenborgianism really was never meant to be a new religion. It was meant to reflect a new paradigm that can be applied to a lot of different religions.
Okay.
But he was very clear that as we progress into that sort of newer age, things like institutional affiliation and dogmatism would actually play less and less of a role. So the notion of establishing a new orthodoxy, which ironically is something that some of us Swedenborgians have done, but that notion, I think, would be quite foreign to Swedenborg himself.
Okay, I want to start winding down. So any other final thoughts on true Christianity? We're going to have to spend more time on each book and all the books going forward because we need content for all different episodes. We got to keep going. So any other final thoughts?
Going. Final thoughts. I did have a final thought, perhaps two final thoughts, which is that something that I often encounter, we just threw all these Swedenborg books at you that were, again, written in scientific Neo-Latin by a dude in the 1700s. And not all of them are super fun to read. I think they're fun to read, but
they're all bangers. Come on.
Well, to each their own. Some people really have a hard time reading Swedenborg, and that is perfectly fine. Once again, beliefs are not salvific. You don't have to understand or appreciate or believe that there are X, Y, and Z angelic kingdoms and so forth in order to be a truthful and good and loving human being. However, if this interests you and you would kind of like more of a brief overview, there are plenty of really great works that have been written with that particular purpose. I think of Dr. Jonathan Rose's Swedenborg's Garden of Theology as one of the more recent ones that does a really great job summarizing. However, there are two books that I always recommend to pretty much anyone in terms of both getting a quick view into who was Swedenborg as well as what are some of the underlying concepts. The first one that I recommend is Swedenborg, An Introduction to His Life and Ideas by Gary Lachman. You can get this book on Amazon. It'll be there quickly. It is published. It was actually been published by different presses. I'm not going to go into it. Initially by the Swedenborg Society, now Toucher Penguin in the US. Wonderful book, partly because it is written by someone who is not an institutionalized Swedenborgian. Neither is he a scholar in the classical sense. So it's just a dude exploring Swedenborg, doing good research, and giving us a very brief, very digestible, modern idea of who Swedenborg is and why he matters. The other one, especially if you want to go a bit more in depth, would be The Presence of Other Worlds by Wilson Van Dusen. Wilson Van Dusen was very much a devoted Swedenborgian. He was a depth psychologist and a just wonderful writer and thinker. And he gives an overview of Swedenborg's life, especially as far as our inner life is concerned, looking at questions of how does this relate to modern psychology and sort of the underlying realities that we face in everyday life. So Gary Lachman, Swedenborg, His Life and Ideas, Wilson Van Dusen, Presence of Other Worlds, and very importantly, all of these books you can get really just anywhere, Amazon, etc. The writings by Swedenborg himself, I recommend you get them at the Swedenborg Foundation, which you can find at Swedenborg.com. Swedenborg.org is the website for our particular denomination. Swedenborg.com is the Swedenborg Foundation. They have all of his published theological works in some form, and they have all of the published New Century Edition ones that they have brought out for free as virtual copies. So you can read all of the ones that I just discussed for free online, or you can order them fairly inexpensively as paperbacks. So check out Swedenborg.com if you want some more material.
I hope to do more work with you, Thom. This is episode 2 already. Oh my God, where did time fly? Anything else we want to mention, plug, promote before we say our goodbyes?
Go to spiritualquesters.org.
Yeah, and that'll be in the YouTube description where you are most likely definitely watching this podcast right now. Okay, so
Excellent.
Again, I'm Rudy Caseres. I am I'm not even a co-host. I'm just the person who is down here, and Thom is all the way up here. So I'm excited though to go. Is that true, Thom?
No.
Okay.
We are all equal in the sight of God.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. So this has been episode 2. Thank you to Thom Muller. Thank you to everyone else watching this podcast. Please, if you're on YouTube, do like, subscribe, and keep supporting us. And then we'll keep doing this. And hopefully there'll be a day where I say, welcome to episode 5,000. And then we'll both be old, and I'll probably have a longer, grayer beard than Thom. So sign us off, Thom, before I say something wrong.
Right. Well, don't do drugs and read Swedenborg.
Bye.